Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the spring of 1946, a peaceful community straddling the Texas-Arkansas border was plunged into terror when a mysterious figure began stalking young couples under the cover of moonlight. Known only as the Phantom, this masked killer would claim 5 lives, leave 3 survivors, and forever change the twin cities of Texarkana. For months, residents lived in fear of a hooded figure who seemed to appear and vanish like a ghost, leaving behind a trail of violence that remains unsolved to this day. This is the story of the Texarkana Moonlight murders. In the spring of 1946, a series of terrifying attacks gripped the twin cities of Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas, leaving residents in a state of panic and forever changing the fabric of this once peaceful community. The events that unfolded would come to be known as the Texarkana Moonlight murders, and to this day, they remain one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. It all began on Friday, February 22nd, 1946. Jimmy Hollis, 25 years old, and his girlfriend Mary Jean Larry, 19, were parked on a lonely lover's lane just off Richmond Road, about 3 miles from downtown Texarkana. Like many young couples of the era, they had gone out for a movie and were spending some time together before heading home. The night was cool and clear, with a bright moon illuminating the surrounding woods. At around 11:45 p.m., their evening took a horrifying turn when a figure approached their car. The man wore a white hood with cutouts for his eyes and mouth, resembling a crude pillowcase mask. He carried a flashlight and pointed it directly at the couple. At first, they thought it might be a prank, but the situation quickly turned violent when the masked man ordered them out of the car at gunpoint. The attacker forced Jimmy Hollis to remove his pants and proceeded to beat him savagely with the barrel of his pistol, fracturing his skull in multiple places. Mary Jean was then ordered to run. As she fled in terror, the assailant caught up with her and sexually assaulted her. Miraculously, both victims survived the attack, though Jimmy would spend several days in the hospital recovering from his injuries. When police investigated, they found the victims' descriptions of their attacker to be detailed and consistent. He was described as being about 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothes, and speaking in a rough voice without any discernible accent. The white hood became a chilling detail that would later become synonymous with the case. The attack was initially treated as an isolated incident by local law enforcement. However, this would prove to be a grave miscalculation. 3 weeks later, on Sunday, March 24th, the killer struck again, this time with deadly results. Richard Griffin, 29, and his girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore, 17, were found dead in Griffin's 1941 Oldsmobile on a lonely stretch of road known as Rich Road, just outside of town. The discovery was made by passing motorists early that Sunday morning. Both victims had been shot in the back of the head with what appeared to be a .32 caliber weapon. The crime scene was particularly disturbing, with evidence suggesting the killer had moved the bodies after the murders. The similarities between the first attack and these murders were impossible to ignore. Both incidents occurred on lovers' lanes, both involved young couples, and both happened late at night. The Texarkana Gazette ran the story on its front page, and fear began to spread through the community. Sheriff W.H. Presley and Police Chief Jack Runnels established a joint task force to investigate the murders, but they had little evidence to work with. Local residents began taking precautions. Hardware stores reported selling out of locks and ammunition. Young people stopped frequenting lovers' lanes, and many parents enforced strict curfews. The police increased patrols, but the vast network of back roads and isolated areas around Texarkana made it impossible to monitor everything. Despite these measures, the killer struck again 3 weeks later, following the same pattern. On April 14, 1946, 17-year-old Paul Martin and 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker were killed after playing a late-night engagement with their band at a local VFW hall. Paul's body was found first, about 4 miles from Spring Lake Park, with 4 gunshot wounds. Betty Jo's body was discovered several hours later, roughly 2 miles away. She had been shot twice. The murders of Martin and Booker shocked the community to its core. Betty Jo was particularly well known in Texarkana as a talented saxophone player who performed with a local band called the Rhythmaires. The fact that these victims were so young and had been killed after a public event rather than while parked on a lover's lane suggested the killer was growing bolder. The investigation intensified. Texas Rangers, including the legendary MT Lone Wolf Gonzalez, were called in to assist. The FBI also joined the investigation, making this one of the largest manhunts in Texas history at the time. Rewards were offered for information leading to the killer's arrest, eventually totaling more than $7,000, a substantial sum in 1946. The city descended into a state of terror. Texarkana essentially became a ghost town after dark. Businesses closed early, streets emptied, and residents armed themselves. Many families slept in shifts, with one person always keeping watch. The sale of guns, locks, and ammunition continued to soar, and many residents nailed their windows shut despite the spring heat. The local media dubbed the killer the Phantom, or the Phantom Killer, names that would stick and become legendary in true crime history. The hooded figure became a terrifying boogeyman, someone who could strike anywhere, at any time, leaving no traces behind. Law enforcement officials worked tirelessly, following hundreds of leads and interviewing countless witnesses. They developed several theories about the killer's identity and motivation, but solid evidence remained elusive. The investigation was hampered by the limitations of forensic science in the 1940s and the killer's careful methods, which left few clues behind. But the Phantom wasn't finished. The terror would continue, and the next attack would prove to be one of the most brazen yet. The night of Friday, May 3, 1946, marked the Phantom's final confirmed attack, and it was notably different from his previous assaults. Rather than targeting young couples in isolated areas, the killer struck at a farmhouse on U.S. Highway 67 East, just outside of Texarkana's city limits. The victims were Virgil Starks, a respected farmer and welder, and his wife Katie. The Starks were spending a quiet evening at home. Virgil, 47, was sitting in his favorite chair reading the newspaper, while Katie, 36, was completing some bookkeeping work in another room. At around 10 p.m., 2 shots suddenly burst through their window, striking Virgil in the back of the head and killing him instantly. The bullets were later identified as .22 caliber, different from the weapon used in previous attacks. Katie heard the shots and ran to help her husband, but as she entered the room, 2 more shots were fired through the window, hitting her in the face. Despite her severe injuries, Katie managed to flee to her bedroom and attempted to call the police. However, she heard the killer trying to enter the house through the back screen door. In a remarkable display of survival instinct, Katie ran out the front door and across the road to her sister's house, leaving a trail of blood in her wake. Her sister and brother-in-law immediately drove her to Michael Meagher Hospital in Texarkana, where she underwent extensive surgery. Katie survived the attack but was left with permanent injuries. She provided police with a brief glimpse of her attacker through the window, a man with a tanned, rough-looking face, but the darkness and chaos of the moment limited her ability to give a detailed description. The attack on the Starks sent shockwaves through the community. Unlike the previous victims, the Starks were a middle-aged couple attacked in their own home. This escalation in the killer's behavior suggested he was becoming more aggressive and unpredictable. The fear that had gripped Texarkana reached new heights. The Texas Rangers, led by Captain Gonzalez, established a command post at the Bowie County Courthouse. They brought in bloodhounds to track the killer's scent from the Starks crime scene, but the trail went cold near a series of tire tracks on a nearby road, suggesting the killer had escaped by car. The investigation began to focus on several suspects. One of the most promising was a young man named H.B. Doody Tennyson, a 21-year-old student at the University of Arkansas. In November 1946, Tennyson died by suicide and left behind a confession claiming responsibility for the murders. However, investigators found numerous inconsistencies in his confession, and ballistics evidence didn't match. They eventually concluded that Tennyson was not the Phantom. Another significant suspect was U.L. Swinney, a career criminal with a history of car theft. His wife, Peggy, provided police with detailed information about the murders that only the killer would know. She claimed UL was responsible for the crimes and had confessed to her. However, Peggy later recanted her testimony, and without physical evidence linking Swinney to the crimes, prosecutors were unable to charge him with the murders. He was eventually imprisoned for car theft, but maintained his innocence regarding the Phantom killings until his death in 1994. The investigation continued throughout 1946, but despite the massive law enforcement presence and the countless hours spent pursuing leads, the Phantom's identity remained a mystery. The killer seemed to have vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind a community forever changed by fear and paranoia. The impact of the Moonlight murders on Texarkana was profound and long-lasting. The city's carefree, small-town atmosphere was replaced by a persistent sense of vulnerability. Residents who lived through that spring of terror never forgot the experience, and the story was passed down through generations, becoming an integral part of local folklore. The case had a significant influence on American popular culture. In 1976, director Charles B. Pierce released The Town That Dreaded Sundown, a film based on the Texarkana Moonlight murders. While the movie took considerable liberties with the facts, it helped bring the case to national attention and cemented the Phantom's place in true crime history. The investigation never officially closed. The files remain open in both Texas and Arkansas, though most of the original investigators have long since passed away. Modern law enforcement officials have occasionally revisited the case, hoping that advances in forensic science might shed new light on the evidence, but the passage of time has made this increasingly unlikely. What makes the Texarkana Moonlight murders particularly haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes or the killer's ability to evade capture, but the way the case challenged small-town America's sense of security. In 1946, Texarkana was a place where people routinely left their doors unlocked and where young couples could safely park on quiet country roads. The Phantom changed all that, ushering in an era of suspicion and fear that would transform not just Texarkana, but similar communities across the nation. The physical evidence from the cases, including the weapons used in the murders, was never found. The killer's hood, which became such a powerful symbol of the terror, was never recovered. Even the basic question of whether all the attacks were committed by the same person remains debatable, though most investigators believe they were. The case files contain thousands of pages of interviews, leads, and theories. They tell the story of an investigation that spanned state lines, involved multiple law enforcement agencies, and captured the nation's attention. But perhaps most importantly, they tell the stories of the victims, young people whose lives were cut tragically short, and survivors who carried the physical and emotional scars of their encounters with the Phantom for the rest of their lives. The investigation into the Texarkana Moonlight murders generated numerous theories about the killer's identity and methodology. One particularly interesting aspect that investigators focused on was the geographic pattern of the attacks. The crimes seemed to form a rough semicircle around the western portion of Texarkana, suggesting the killer might have lived or worked in that area. This theory was supported by the killer's apparent familiarity with the back roads and lovers' lanes where the attacks took place. The Texas Rangers, particularly Captain Gonzalez, developed a psychological profile of the killer that was remarkably advanced for its time. They believed the phantom was likely a white male in his 30s, someone who appeared ordinary enough to move through the community without drawing attention. The profile suggested he probably held a regular job and might even have been considered a respectable member of society. The investigation also revealed several curious details that were never fully explained. For instance, at the Martin and Booker crime scene, Betty Jo's saxophone was found carefully placed in its case, suggesting the killer might have had some reverence for musical instruments, or perhaps knew Betty Jo personally. The weapon changes between attacks, from a .32 caliber to a .22 caliber in the Starks shooting, led some investigators to believe there might have been a copycat killer, or that the phantom deliberately changed weapons to confuse police. The surviving victims' testimonies provided some of the most valuable insights into the killer's behavior. Mary Jean Larey, who survived the first attack, noted that the man seemed to take pleasure in terrorizing his victims rather than just killing them outright. She described how he would alternate between threatening violence and speaking in an almost conversational tone, suggesting a person who enjoyed the power he held over his victims. Katie Starks, who survived the final attack, provided another crucial detail. She remembered that just before the shooting, their dog had not barked or shown any signs of distress. This suggested that the killer might have been someone familiar to the area, or perhaps even known to the dog. This detail led investigators to focus more intensely on local suspects, though this avenue ultimately proved fruitless. The investigation also uncovered several witnesses who reported seeing a man matching the phantom's description in the days before and after various attacks. A gas station attendant reported serving a customer wearing dark clothes and acting nervously just hours before the Griffin Moore murders. A railroad worker claimed to have seen a man running from the direction of the Starks residence on the night of that attack. However, like many aspects of the case, these leads eventually went cold. The role of the media in the case was significant and somewhat controversial. The Texarkana Gazette, while providing crucial public safety information, was criticized by some law enforcement officials for sensationalizing the crimes. The paper's dramatic headlines and detailed coverage, while serving to keep the public informed, also contributed to the growing panic. Some investigators believed the media attention might have actually encouraged the killer, giving him the notoriety he possibly craved. The case also highlighted the limitations of 1940s forensic science. While investigators did their best to collect and preserve evidence, they lacked many of the tools we take for granted today. There was no DNA analysis, no computerized databases, and no advanced ballistics comparison techniques. Fingerprint analysis was available but primitive by today's standards, and the killer seemed careful not to leave any prints behind. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case was the sudden cessation of the attacks after the Starks shooting. Criminal psychologists who later studied the case suggested several theories for this. Some believed the killer might have been imprisoned for another crime, while others theorized he might have moved to another area. A more disturbing possibility was that he simply continued his crimes elsewhere, but changed his methodology enough to avoid connection to the Texarkana murders. The impact on law enforcement procedures was lasting. The case led to significant changes in how multiple jurisdictions coordinated their efforts in major investigations. The cooperation between Texas and Arkansas law enforcement agencies, while not always smooth, set important precedents for future cross-border investigations. The social impact on Texarkana was equally profound. The murders marked the end of an era of innocence for the Twin Cities. Even after the immediate fear subsided, residents maintained a heightened sense of security awareness. Young people no longer felt safe parking on lonely roads, and the practice of courting in cars largely disappeared from local culture. Many residents who lived through that period reported that they never again felt completely safe, even in their own homes. The lingering effects of the Texarkana Moonlight murders extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of 1946. Decades later, residents who were children during that terrifying spring still recalled how their parents would check and recheck door locks, keep weapons close at hand, and scrutinize every unfamiliar face in town. The psychological impact of the murders created a generational trauma that would be passed down through Texarkana families. Law enforcement officials who worked the case in subsequent years discovered interesting connections and patterns that weren't apparent during the initial investigation. For instance, a detailed analysis of police records showed that reports of prowlers and peeping toms had increased significantly in the months leading up to the first attack. While these incidents were never definitively linked to the Phantom, they suggested a possible escalation in the killer's behavior before the violent attacks began. The case files also revealed several promising leads that were never fully explored due to the technological limitations of the time. In the Griffin Moore murders, for example, investigators found distinctive tire tracks at the scene. Modern forensic experts who later reviewed the case suggested that these tracks might have provided crucial evidence if today's more sophisticated analysis methods had been available. One particularly intriguing aspect of the case that emerged in later years involved the possible connection to other unsolved murders in the surrounding states. Several cases in Louisiana and Oklahoma during the late 1940s shared similar characteristics with the Phantom's attacks, though no definitive link was ever established. These included couples attacked in parked cars and the use of similar caliber weapons. The investigation into U.L. Swinney, one of the primary suspects, continued to generate interest long after the original manhunt ended. His wife Peggy's initial statement to police contained details that seemed to prove inside knowledge of the crimes. She described specific aspects of the murder scenes that hadn't been made public, including the position of Betty Jo Booker's body and details about the weapon used in the Starks shooting. When questioned about her recantation years later, she remained evasive, leading some investigators to believe she had been pressured or threatened into changing her story. The case also had an unexpected impact on American car culture. In the post-war years, teenagers parking in isolated areas had become a common social phenomenon, but the Phantom murders helped bring about the end of this practice in many communities. Drive-in theaters, which offered a safer alternative to lovers' lanes, saw increased popularity in the years following the murders, not just in Texarkana but across the country. Local law enforcement agencies maintained files on several other suspects besides Swinney and Tennyson, some of which weren't made public until decades later. One suspect was a former military man who had been stationed near Texarkana during the war and had a history of violent behavior. Another was a local mechanic who knew the area's back roads well and had unexpectedly left town shortly after the Starks murder. However, none of these leads ever produced enough evidence for an arrest. The Texas Rangers investigation files, partially released in the 1990s, revealed that Captain Gonzalez had developed several theories about the killer's occupation. He believed the Phantom might have been someone whose job required late-night hours, explaining his ability to move around after dark without arousing suspicion. This could have included taxi drivers, newspaper delivery men, or shift workers at one of the local factories. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was its impact on the survivors. Mary Jean Larey, who survived the first attack, struggled with the psychological aftermath for the rest of her life. In interviews given years later, she described having recurring nightmares about the man in the white hood and being unable to feel safe in dark places. Katie Starks, who survived the final attack, never returned to live in her home on Highway 67, and the property stood empty for many years before being demolished. The case files contain numerous witness statements that were considered unreliable at the time, but gained new significance in light of later criminal profiling techniques. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man matching the Phantom's general description, watching young couples at local restaurants and dance halls in the weeks before attacks. While these sightings couldn't be verified, they aligned with modern understanding of how serial killers often observe and select their victims in advance. The Texarkana Moonlight murders also influenced law enforcement training procedures. The case became a frequent topic of study at police academies, particularly in terms of managing multi-jurisdictional investigations and handling media relations during major cases. The investigation's shortcomings and successes provided valuable lessons for future generations of law enforcement officers. The case's impact on popular culture extended beyond the town that dreaded sundown. The image of the killer in a white hood influenced numerous horror films and stories, and the case has been featured in countless true crime books and documentaries. However, many Texarkana residents felt these portrayals sensationalized their community's tragedy and failed to capture the true horror of those months in 1946. Archaeological studies conducted in the 1990s at some of the crime scenes revealed additional evidence that hadn't been discovered during the original investigation. While much of this evidence was too degraded to be useful, it suggested that the original crime scene examinations might have missed crucial details, a common issue with 1940s-era forensic techniques. As decades passed, cold case investigators continued to examine the Texarkana Moonlight murders, employing new technologies and investigative techniques that weren't available in 1946. In the early 2000s, several pieces of evidence from the original investigation were submitted for DNA testing, though the results were inconclusive due to the age and condition of the samples. One particularly interesting development came from retired FBI profilers who reviewed the case files in the 2010s. They noted that the Phantom's pattern of escalation, from assault to murder and finally to home invasion, was unusual for the time period, but fits well with our modern understanding of serial killer behavior. They suggested that the Phantom might have committed other crimes before the Texarkana attacks, possibly in other locations, but these would have gone unconnected due to the limited communication between law enforcement agencies in the 1940s. The geographical profiling of the crimes, when analyzed with modern techniques, revealed interesting patterns. The killer seemed to have a comfort zone centered around the western part of Texarkana, but also demonstrated intimate knowledge of the back roads and remote areas. This suggested someone who either lived in the area for a long time or whose occupation required extensive travel throughout the region. The Starks attack, being so different from the others, continued to puzzle investigators. Some theorized that the change in method, attacking a couple in their home rather than in a car, might have been triggered by the increased police presence at known lovers' lanes. Others suggested that the different weapon used in this attack could indicate that the Phantom had lost or disposed of his previous gun, possibly after learning that police were attempting to match bullet striations. In 2018, a team of forensic scientists used advanced photographic analysis techniques to examine surviving crime scene photos. While they couldn't definitively identify the killer, they were able to determine that the footprints found at several of the crime scenes likely came from the same type of military-style boot, common in the post-World War II era. This supported the theory that the Phantom might have been a veteran, something many investigators had long suspected. The case also sparked renewed interest in similar unsolved murders from the same era. Researchers discovered at least 3 other cases within a 200-mile radius of Texarkana between 1946 and 1948 that shared some characteristics with the Phantom's attacks, though no definitive connection was ever established. the story of the Texarkana Moonlight murders continues to resonate with new generations. Local historians maintain archives of case materials, and the Texarkana Museum System features an exhibit about the murders, focusing not just on the crimes themselves, but on their lasting impact on the community. The exhibit includes items like original newspapers, police reports, and photographs, helping to preserve this crucial piece of local history. Perhaps most poignantly, the case serves as a reminder of how a series of brutal crimes can fundamentally alter a community's character. The Texarkana of today still bears the scars of 1946, not just in its history books, but in the collective memory of its residents. The Phantom Killer may never be identified, but his legacy lives on in the changed behaviors, attitudes, and fears that he instilled in this border community. The case remains officially open in both Texas and Arkansas, though most of the original investigators, witnesses, and suspects have passed away. While the chances of solving the case grow slimmer with each passing year, the mystery of the Phantom continues to captivate new generations of true crime researchers and amateur sleuths, all hoping to finally unmask the killer who terrorized Texarkana in the spring of 1946.